Recording. Cool. All right. So I'm going to show you basically a couple things. We're going to look at the disclosures that are required that are in zip forms, or I should say transactions. Now I got to get used to not calling it zip forms anymore, now that they've rebranded. Before we do that, actually, I want to share with you something else. I want to show you where you can see our information regarding disclosures inside of Command. So if any of you are so crazy that you want to do your own TC work, which I never recommend, here's where to find the checklists. But otherwise, yeah, rely on them. So let me just show you this real quickly, and then we'll jump back into transactions. So inside of Command, it is important for you guys to know where this stuff exists. Here's our home screen. If I go down to opportunities, right? Opportunities. When you click on opportunities, here's where you have your pipeline. Okay, so as you put deals together, you should be, moving along the pipeline process for a lot of reasons. I mean, you want to collect data around your own business. You want to see what your conversion rates are. And then, like I said, your transactions are going to live in here. So down here under buyers, you can see I have one person noted under contract. I'm going to click that. And then I've got my little cards here for where in the under contract process they are. So here I am. If I click that, it gets me to the opportunity details. And if I go a little further to the right here, documents, okay, documents. If I click the link for documents, this is where the compliance section of Command lives. And I can choose right here where it says residential, I can drop this little caret down and it'll show me the different checklists that are available for me. Okay, so I'm defaulted here on residential. And if I needed another one, there's other options there. Okay, so when you first go into one of these opportunities, there'll be no checklist selected. So you would be forced to have to choose which one of these do you want. And you would check residential for most cases. And it'll pull up these three folders here: consultation, under contract, and closed. Okay, so these three folders. If I go to under contract, I scroll past the purchase agreement, I'm going to start getting into all the forms that are needed, right? Like the statewide buyer and seller advisory. You notice it's right here noted as required. And if I go a little farther, I'll start seeing other disclosures like the septic, well, and property monument, and a little farther the TDS, the ESD, the SPQ, the AVID. So we're going to look at all those right now, but I wanted to show you how to get to where these exist so you know where to reference them in the future. Okay, let's go back to transactions. And I tried to make my little folder here in the same order as they are inside of Command. Okay, so let's jump into this. Let's take a look and see what we got. The very first one is not actually in Command, but it is one I recommend you use. It's this disclosure information advisory. And what this is a 3-page form that you can give to your sellers, and it explains how to fill out the disclosures, right? So in paragraph 2 and paragraph 3, first it has preparing to complete your disclosures and your obligations. Number 3, it has instructions for completing the forms. And it tells them, like, if there's a box that says yes or no, it's probably asking them if they are aware. And if you don't know, that means you're not aware. So you would check the no box. I get this all the time. Another agent or a seller will say, oh, I'm not filling out the TDS because I didn't live there. Okay, it doesn't matter if you live there or not. What matters is if you're aware of anything. And if you are not aware of any of the questions, you just pick no for all of them. Okay, but chances are you do know something. By the way, before I go into the disclosures with my client, I preface the conversation and I use some language that the CAR attorneys give us. And basically it says to tell your seller that these documents are your shield to protect you from being sued. These documents are your shield to protect you from being sued. And Mr. and Mrs. Seller, you don't have insurance. So if you are sued, you're going to have to pay to defend yourself. You'll be spending your own money, whereas I am insured. right? We have errors and omissions insurance for defense if there is an error or an omission. You don't carry that, Mr. and Mrs. Seller. So not only could you potentially be having to defend yourself, you might ultimately have to pay attorney's fees as well. So please take these documents extremely seriously. Okay. You don't want them to just grab the documents and just check no for everything, right? They need to go through and really dial it in. And that's why I like starting with the disclosure information advisory for sellers here, because it tells them, what their obligations are and how to complete the forms. So I'm not going to go line by line through almost any of these documents. But I do want to explain to you what they are and how you can use them. That's how you would use this. You would give them this information. Probably a good practice would be to email the PDF of this first before you send any of the disclosures and say, read through this, and here's what my expectations are. Here's what we're supposed to be doing in terms of disclosing, and these documents are your shield, et cetera, et cetera. And once you've read through this, I'm going to send you the DocuSign for everything that you need to complete. That way they have a frame to kind of understand the importance of what these documents are and how to complete them. Okay. As always, if you have questions, drop it in the chat or unmute yourself and let me know. Okay. So it's a 3-pager. The second page goes into actually completing some of the more important ones like the TDS, the transfer disclosure statement, the seller property questionnaire. Okay. And the exempt seller disclosure if we're using that in place of the TDS or the SPQ. Okay. All right. So that is the disclosure information advisory. Again, it's not in the required documents, but it is a best practice. I highly recommend it. The next one we got here is the statewide buyer and seller advisory. If I had to pick a favorite, this might just be it. Why? Because it's literally 14 pages of things that the buyer and seller should disclose about or investigate about. And, not including such things as errant golf balls and proximity to lakes, things that just aren't going to apply on all of your transactions. But basically, it's going to break down a couple of paragraphs here. So what are the buyer's rights and duties? Goes into inspections and asking questions about the property or anything that's a concern for them. And then it talks about the seller's rights and duties. What's the seller's rights and duties? Well, we got to disclose all known material facts and defects that could affect the value or desirability of the property. And then what about us? What about us as brokers? Well, we got, some duties here. We have to disclose any matters affecting the property, and we got to conduct a visual inspection and so on. Okay. We also, as brokers, have to remember where the line is. We are not going to conduct certain investigations like getting permits or managing contractors, things like that, because that's outside the scope of our license, right? Keep that in mind. And then, like I said, this is a matrix of everything they're going to talk about inside of this 14-pager. Easements, environmental hazards, formaldehyde, again down here, golf course disclosures, death on the property, community enhancement. There's so much in here, right? And so what is this? It's basically a catch-all to say, here's everything that we've been able to think of that you should be concerned about, buyer, and that you should disclose about, seller, if you are aware. Okay, so again, we're not going to go through everything on here, but I would say when you pull this form up to review, you should look at page 2 and look at A through G here to see all the different topics that we're recommending people investigate or we're recommending sellers to disclose about if they know of anything that is a fact or a defect. Okay. So that is our SBSA. That is required. Moving on. The next one here. You may not use this in every transaction, depending on the circumstances. Why? Because this has to do with septic inspection, well inspection, and property monument and propane tank allocation of cost addendum. Okay. So, here in a lot of LA County, we're not going to deal with any of these issues. But if we start getting a little farther out where there are septic inspections, or I actually just for the first time in a long time saw a deal that we just closed where all the heating is on propane. And the seller said, I'm not leaving my propane tank. You got to buy your own, right? But they would leave it for investigations and that's it. So in paragraph 1, we're talking about septic inspection and allocation of cost check all that apply. And basically it's asking, well, who's going to pay for the inspection and the report? Who's going to find it? Who's going to pay for the location and access, meaning digging it up, right? Who's going to pay to have it pumped and cleaned? Who's going to pay to have it inspected and certified, right? Who's going to pay to excavate if necessary? And then if check alternative septic systems, which may or may not apply. So rarely are you guys mostly going to be using these forms, but they will come up from time to time, and that's totally fine. And usually you'll give me a call to ask, how do I use this? How do I fill this out? Who's paying? In most cases, I would say the seller is probably paying for the inspection and certification of the septic. The next one is well inspection and allocation of cost. Again, from time to time, you may sell a property that doesn't have city water or access to city water, and they have a well that they access for their household water. So same thing, right? Who's paying for what? Who's paying for what? Generally, you may get a government report if it's available, and that's probably about it. You can test for productivity, you can test for bacteria, things of that nature. And again, this is all in negotiation between the buyer and the seller. Okay, a lot of this stuff, generally speaking, for these specific types, will fall on the seller side of a transaction. Okay. Next, number 3, property, monument, corners, and boundaries. Right. So sometimes you're going to sell. This will be pretty rare, but you may sell a piece of property that has, monuments that say where the lot lines are. And it could be things like a river or a lake or, the big oak tree down the road or whatever. So anyways, at the end of the day, what it says here is that everybody needs to acknowledge that only a licensed surveyor can mark monuments, corners, and boundaries. Okay. And so we're basically saying, if you want to know where your boundaries of your lot line are, you need to have a surveyor come out and you need to pay for that. When you're looking at rural property, the seller may pick that up. Now, if we're here in LA County, Long Beach, or wherever, Cerritos, La Mirada, where we may be, and you're just in a tract, you're probably not going to hire a surveyor to figure out where the lot line is. And if you are, it's probably going to be at the buyer's expense. And this is probably going to cost in the thousands of dollars. This is not something that is cheap to do. Okay. And then lastly, as I mentioned, sometimes you'll have a property that has, doesn't have city gas coming to the property to hook up a floor furnace, wall furnace, or forced air system. So in this instance, you have propane. And so there's a option here about, is it leased or owned? And how much is in the tank? Because that's property that comes with, the propane. And then is somebody going to pay to fill it up, basically? Okay. So again, very uncommon for where we live, but comes up once in a while. So as you have questions around these specifics, you'll reach out and let me know. All right, let's keep going. Next, probably our number one most important form in the disclosure world is the TDS, the Real Estate Transfer Disclosure Statement. Okay. And this is mandated to provide in most transactions. There are some exemptions for when a TDS is not required. And most of those exemptions revolve around whether or an entity is selling the property. So when you think of probate, right, the person's deceased and you have an administrator handling the affairs, or a corporation or a trust. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they're automatically exempt. And if you need help, you'll reach out and ask. For instance, when you have like a living trust, sometimes a husband and wife will have a living trust. If they're still alive, living in the property or not, they need to do a TDS. Okay, they need to still complete that. But just because it's in a trust doesn't mean they're exempt automatically. So there are some exemptions, but not all are applicable. The most common ones we'll ever see are going to be like probate or foreclosure, like an REO, real estate owned by a bank-owned properties. So a couple sections here. Number 1, coordination with other disclosure forms. There's a section here that says, are you using any other documents as substituted disclosures? Meaning, well, I'm not going to do the TDS. I'm just going to give the buyer a physical inspection report. Okay. That's not good enough. For us at our offices, we're always going to check this box right here. No substituted disclosures for this transfer. We're not substituting, and we're not letting our clients substitute any disclosures when we think about transferring this piece of real estate. And frankly, what it does is it puts your client at risk if you try to skirt the law and not provide the necessary disclosures. Okay. Number two, it talks about seller information, and now it's going to go into first, is a seller occupying or not the property? And then section A has a whole big section here where all you got to do is check off whether or not the property has the items that are listed below. Okay. And you can see what it starts off on: range and oven and microwave. Actually, you're supposed to read from left to right: range, window, wall, AC, pool, etc. Okay. All these things. And all you're doing is checking off whether they exist or not. You're not stating yet whether there's any issues or not. You're just checking what is there inside of the property. And that's what the seller is now representing. Now, I have this question come up from time to time. If we check something off here, does that mean it's automatically included in the sale? Let's say my purchase agreement says that the wall AC, right, does not come with the property. But then the seller checks the box here, right? Just by checking that box doesn't mean it comes with the property. It just says that it exists in the property currently. Okay, so don't worry about that. You can still check the box and make your disclosure as necessary. So at the bottom here is where we have a question. It says, are there, to the best of the seller's knowledge, any of the above that are not in operating condition? So if the spa heater doesn't work, you would check the box and say no. Or, I'm sorry, yes. Yes, the spa heater is not in operating condition. And then describe. And there's a section here to write in whatever is not functioning or not operating as it should. That very first form we looked at, the disclosure information advisory, says on it, if you check that there's a yes to something, yes, something's not working properly, you need to explain, describe, attach additional information, whatever is necessary to make a note, okay, about whatever's not functioning as it should, okay? When we move on to page 2, paragraph B says, are you the seller aware of any significant defects or malfunctions in any of the below here? Interior walls, ceilings, floors, exterior walls, like all the structural components, basically, right? So I would call this first section systems, right? The systems in the property. And then B are the structural components: roof, foundation, plumbing, or floors, windows, et cetera, et cetera. Plumbing would be a system, which would be up here, okay? All right. And then lastly is paragraph C. And paragraph C is where we're looking at things that are basically other compliance issues or other things of note. Okay, so number 1 talks about environmental hazards like asbestos or radon gas, lead-based paint. 2 talks about whether there's any features of the property shared in common with adjoining landowners. I mean, that's almost always a yes, right? Usually we've got a fence line or something that both owners share. Number 3, any encroachments, easements, or similar that affect the interest in the property. 4 and 5 talk about room additions, modifications, alterations, either made with or without necessary permits or not in compliance with building codes. Number 6 talks about fill, which is like compacted soil. Number 7 talks about settling or slippage, sliding, other soil issues. Sometimes you'll see a house where the doors don't close perfectly, the frame's a little bit out of out of square, basically, and that would be an indication of potential settling, right? Now, just because you notice that doesn't mean it's automatically settling. There could be another issue. So you just have to guide your seller to remind them, when you're disclosing, all you're doing is stating facts, whatever you observe. So maybe you don't say that there's any settling. Maybe you just write in there that the bedroom door is out of square, okay, or it sticks, doesn't close properly. 8, flooding or drainage or grading problems. 9, damage from fire, earthquake, floods, or landslides, which we're seeing more and more. 10 would be zoning violations, non-conforming uses, violation of setback, right? Non-conforming means it's not in compliance with the city's building code. Setback is basically any property you have was going to have setback requirements. And a setback is how close to the lot lines can dwellings be, can a garage be, can a fence be, things of that nature, okay? 11, neighborhood noises, problems, or other nuisances, right? Neighborhood sounds, even neighborly disputes, that kind of stuff I would absolutely disclose. 12, CC&Rs or other deed restrictions. So a CC&R is a covenant, condition, or restriction, which usually we see mostly associated with homeowners associations. 13, homeowners association. 14 would be common areas, like in a HOA. 15, notices of abatement or citations against the property. And then 16, any sort of legal claims, lawsuits against the seller affecting the property, claims for breach, warranty, et cetera, et cetera. And again, if anything's checked yes, they need to write in here the description, what is the concern? And then we get to D, and D basically is a certification. The first one says that we will have operable smoke detectors, which are approved by the state fire marshal. And then the second one says that we'll be in compliance with water heater to make sure it's braced, anchored, or strapped to resist falling during an earthquake. So these are actual representations because these are government mandated requirements. Okay, that's why there's no check boxes to say yes or no. It's a seller giving a certification. Page 3, the seller signs. And then you as the agent now have your obligation. So on the listing side, broker representing the seller, you're going to make a note of whether you're doing an AVID, whether you note no item for disclosure, or whether you're going to try to fit all of your disclosure in this box. Okay. For all of us at KW, PE, Cerritos, Long Beach, La Mirada, we're always checking this box. We're always using the agent visual inspection disclosure form because you are all going to do a very thorough investigation of the properties that you're selling. These are required, by the way, the TDS, SPQ, any residential up to 4 units. So that includes houses, duplexes, fourplexes, condos, townhomes, planned unit developments, et cetera, okay? The buyer agent is going to complete their declaration or their inspection, and then everybody re-signs at the bottom, okay? So that's the TDS 3-pager. If the TDS is required, which it usually is going to be, we must have a SPQ, the seller property questionnaire, okay? So the purchase agreement actually states in there that if a TDS is required, the seller must complete an SPQ as well, okay? Again, it's more of the same with the TDS, but really what we're doing here is we're expanding and going a little bit deeper into some other questions, okay? The first part of the disclosure requirement on this form is paragraph 5. And note here, statutorily or contractually required or related. These 10 questions here are statutorily required, meaning the local or city, state, or county government requires these by law, these questions by all parties. So even if a party is exempt from the transfer disclosure statement, they still are going to answer these questions, albeit on a different form, which we'll look at in a second. So what are the statutory requirements? Well, did somebody die on the property in the last 3 years? Was there an order from a government health official that identified the property as being contaminated by methamphetamines? Was there the release of an illegal controlled substance on or beneath the property? Is the property located in or adjacent to an industrial use zone, right? Manufacturing, commercial, airport, right? I'm not too close to Long Beach Airport, but I can hear planes all day. So I would say, yeah, I'm affected by this. I'm affected by a commercial zone because I got a school a few doors down, and a block or 2 away are some grocery stores. So I would say yes to all this stuff, right? Is the property affected by a nuisance created by an industrial use zone, right? So one is it located near, and one is it creating a nuisance. So, sometimes if you're right in the flight path and you really hear the planes coming, you're affected by a nuisance, right? I would say you're affected by that, okay? Or maybe there's a smell from a refinery nearby or whatever that might be, okay? F asks if we're within a mile of a formal federal or state ordnance location. Ordnance meaning explosives from some sort of military related, right? Training or base or what have you, okay? So, nearby we do have National Guard, we do have the Seal Beach Naval Weapons Depot. So there is some of this stuff nearby. So, pay attention, be aware. Next is disclosing whether the property is a condo or a planned unit development. After that, are there any insurance claims against the property in the past 5 years? Insurability of a property is a contingency of the agreement. So we need to know this information. Matters affecting title to the property. Are you aware of any matters affecting title? Next would be any material facts or defects not otherwise disclosed. There's anything else you can think of, right? And then lastly, K, plumbing fixtures on the property that are non-compliant as defined by civil code. We'll see more about non-compliant plumbing fixtures, but these are going to be faucets, toilets, shower heads that have a rate of water flow that is that exceeds the civil code, right? In California, we're all about water conservation, so we actually have low flow toilets and shower heads and so on and so forth. Okay. All right. I wanted to show you those specific questions because they're always required in every transaction. I'm not going to go into every question on the rest of this document. It's 4 pages, but the headers are talking about repairs and alterations, structural issues, disaster relief or insurance, right? Flooding, fire, etc. Water related and mold issues, any pets on the property or that affect the property, boundaries and access by others, landscaping, pool, spa, condo information, title information, neighborhood information, governmental, and other. So those are like the main headers, and your seller can read through and find out if any of these things apply to them, and then they will then use that as a disclosure. It's a simple checklist. It makes it really easy. And just remember, if there's a yes, we need an explanation, okay? All right, let's keep plugging away. The next one, exempt seller disclosure, the ESD. So what is this? Well, if you notice here, the ESD is a 1-pager. And look, paragraph 4 has all the questions that we just looked at, the same exact questions that we just looked at. If a seller is exempt from a TDS, then they also don't need to provide an SPQ, but they do need to provide the exempt seller disclosure. And I don't know of any exemption to not provide this document, okay? Because there's a whole bunch of, again, statutorily government required questions and disclosures on this, okay? All right, let's keep going since we looked at all those already. All right, the AVID. You remember on the transfer disclosure statement we looked at, we were checking the box that says we're going to provide an agent visual inspection, okay? And this is a great form because it tells you that you got to go do your own investigation. It also tells you what to look for and what you don't look for, which we'll get to in a second. And then you're asked to disclose if the property is a duplex, triplex, or fourplex. If it's more than 1 unit, you're going to do an individual AVID for each unit, okay? By the way, if it's multi-unit, 2, 3, 4 units, technically the seller does not need to do a TDS or an SPQ for each individual unit, but it is considered the best practice. So the seller should do a TDS and SPQ for each individual unit. That is definitely the best practice. Not legally required, but we highly recommend it, okay? So the avid here, California law requires, with limited exceptions, that a broker or salesperson conduct a reasonably competent and diligent visual inspection of reasonably and normally accessible areas. Okay. So normally accessible, reasonably accessible, meaning you're not crawling under the house. You're not going on the roof. You're not opening every single cupboard or drawer. Okay. California law does not require the agent to conduct inspections on areas that are not reasonably and normally accessible, areas off-site of the property, meaning neighborhood or local issues, public records or permits. Okay, we're not supposed to pull permits or look at public records. Why? Because we're not qualified to interpret or understand what those documents reference or talk about. We're not contractors. That's the appropriate party that is a professional that can do that. We're not obligated or require us to go look at any of the common areas or the planned development sites for condos and stock co-ops, PUDs, that kind of stuff. Inspection limitations. This is a section that says what you don't have to look for. Well, like I said, the roof, the attic, okay? In the interior, we're not going to move or look behind or underneath furniture, behind pictures, behind wall hangings or coverings, floor coverings, carpet, rugs, etc. We're not looking up into the chimneys. We're not going into all the cabinets. We're not opening any doors that are locked, etc. We're not going underneath the house. We're not going to go even climb up or down a hillside, move or look behind plants, bushes, or shrubs. Like, we're not here to do a full-on, invasive disclosure. We're doing a reasonably competent and diligent visual, not physical investigation or inspection. We're not going to operate appliances or systems. Okay. So we're not going to turn on the stove, the washer and dryer, the dishwasher, the range, the AC, the heat. Okay. And you're not doing any of that stuff. Size of property or improvements. You're not going to measure anything at all, right? You're not going to try to find boundaries. You're not going to walk out in the street and say, it looks like the lot line's here. You have no idea. So don't say anything about it. It's not your job, right? The best thing you guys can do as agents is really learning where the line is and then utilizing the rest of your team. So if someone says, where's the lot line? And the last thing you want to do is go say, looks like right about here. You'll say, that's a good question. I don't know. I'm not qualified to know. If you want to know, you should hire a surveyor. And then you put that in writing, okay? Environmental hazards, we're not qualified to investigate. Off-property conditions, we're not required to investigate. And the analysis of agent disclosure. So what does this mean? Well, it means we're not going to analyze anything that we've been told that's outside the realm of real estate, okay? So if we get an SPQ that says there's a leak or some staining on the ceiling, we're not going to analyze to figure out what the staining is from. We're not going to try to guess either, okay? So basically, it's a limited investigation, and they make it really easy. Who's doing the inspection? What's the date and time? What's the weather like? Who else is in the property at the inspection? And then they just give you a checklist. Just go and walk through and check all the rooms and then walk the exterior. What I typically do is I just start in the front, outside. I scan the front, try to look at the roof line as best I can. I walk the sides of the property, go to the back, and I do all the outside first. And then I go on the inside and just go, kitchen, living room, bedrooms, bathrooms, and call it a day. Okay. For your avids, couple things. Never say anything good about the property. Okay. This is not what the avid is for. We're not here to say, place looks great, newly remodeled, totally upgraded. Because what you're doing is you're making a warranty, right? And all you're doing is creating problems for yourself when the buyer moves in and says, you said the place looked great. Well, look at that stain over there. That doesn't look great to me, right? And so now you've represented what great means, which is subjective. Okay, so that's one thing. And then secondly, never use adjectives. Never use adjectives to describe the property. So we're not going to say good, bad, big, small, etc. Right? If you see a crack on the ceiling, you're not going to say there was a big crack on the ceiling. You're going to say there was a crack about 3 feet long, starting from the chandelier heading west. You're going to be very specific and descriptive. And again, you're not there to analyze. You're there to identify. So all you're doing is factually stating what you've observed, and that's it, right? So that's how you conduct an avid. Both agents will do one of these, buyer side and listing side. If you double N, represent both parties, you only need to do one, and one for each unit, as I said.
Nick,
All right. Yes.
For listings, when should this be completed?
Great question. So first and foremost, all disclosures from the seller are required to be delivered to the buyer within 7 days. The TDS, the second piece to this, the TDS right here, is not considered fully complete until the listing agent completes their agent visual inspection. So what does that mean? It means it needs to be completed and delivered with all the disclosures by the seller within 7 days. Here's something interesting. If the TDS is not complete, any of these questions not done, this question not done, this question not done, any of these not done, or the agent doesn't provide the avid, it's not considered complete, and it gives the buyer a cancellation right, even if they've removed all of their contingencies. So you as an agent, if you don't do your avid on the listing side until the final walkthrough, and then you give it to the buyer, you just triggered a 5-day right of rescission, and the buyer can cancel based on anything that's in that avid, even if they've removed all their contingencies. Okay. So get these done as soon as possible. If you're taking a listing, whenever you're at the house, even prior to it going on the market, get the avid done right up front. If you're the buyer, the easiest time to do it is at the inspection, obviously, right? So sooner the better. I see these come in all the time at the very end, at the very close of escrow. Okay. Not good. Not good.
So, sorry. So if you signed a listing agreement that's, the listing doesn't, it's planned to be 3 months out on the market, just the sooner the better, even if with a 3-month time span?
I mean, if there's going to be a gap from when it actually hits the market, you may wait. You can still do it, but you'd want to go back out to make sure nothing has changed and verify the information that you put on there, which means you're probably just going to wait and do it anyways.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. All right. Great question. Thank you. Let's keep going. So the next one we got here, the WCMD, water conserving and plumbing fixtures, carbon monoxide. So as we mentioned on the TDS, the seller has to disclose to the buyer whether anything is a water conserving fixture not in compliance. Okay. It's a little bit complicated, but basically the first paragraph says that as of 2017, any single family residences must be retrofitted with water conserving plumbing fixtures, shower heads, toilets, sink faucets. If you happen to have a urinal in your property, that is also referenced on here, right? So anyways, it says that we're supposed to have them retrofitted. Now, what it actually says is that the property is supposed to have low flow fixtures. What it doesn't say, though, is that there's any sort of requirement for the seller to have to conduct any of these changes. They just have to disclose to the buyer what the requirement is and whether they're aware of anything that is not compliant. Okay, so that's how this form basically works. It's not an automatic, you have to put in low flow everything. It just says you have to, if you're aware of anything, tell the buyer about it. Okay, and that's what this form is for. Number 2 is carbon monoxide detectors. So this basically says that there's a installation requirement and it needs to be done. And your appraisers are going to call this stuff out. So your carbon monoxide requirement is 1 on every floor of the property. Okay, 1 on every floor. That's it. All right, let's go back and we'll keep moving on the same vein here. The next one is the water heater and smoke detector requirement. Okay, this is a statement of compliance. And we actually just looked at it in the TDS. We already saw that there is a statement that says the seller will have the water heater, anchor brace, or strap to resist falling during an earthquake, and that they will have smoke detectors in compliance with local requirements, which basically is one in every bedroom and then one in the hallways leading to every bedroom. Okay. If we have a TDS, this form is not required. If we don't have a TDS, this form is required. Okay, because again, it overlaps with what's on the transfer disclosure statement. Okay, let's keep going. I can't see all of you, so I'm hoping you're all awake still. We're just going, man. We're going. Lead-based paint. Okay, lead-based paint hazards. Another 2-pager. Basically, what this says here is whether the seller is aware of any lead-based paint on the property, or if they've ever done any inspections for lead-based paint on the property. This form is for all properties that were built prior to 1978. So if your year built was 1979, this is not required. How do we fill it out? Simply paragraph 1. Do we have any knowledge of lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards? If yes, write it in the notes here. Part 2 of this is, have you ever done a report or have any records about lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards? If yes, fill it in. If the seller is not aware of any lead-based paint, then they would just leave all this stuff blank. They would sign, and that's their affidavit. Okay, if that makes sense. Moving on. Okay, the next one we have, if you look here, it says 1 of 6, 2 of 6, 3 of 6, all the way down to 6 of 6. These are all relating to earthquake hazards, reports, etc. And then it comes with a booklet that includes things about lead, home energy rating, and other environmental hazards. Okay, so our obligation here is to give our clients a booklet that covers environmental hazards, lead, energy, earthquake, etc. Okay, so 1 through 4 are the actual booklets. Okay, and I want to show you something real quickly, where to find these. When you log into your transactions from CAR and we add forms, we go up here to all forms, or we use this little caret. And that's where we can go in and find all of the forms that CAR provides to us. And there's a ton. And we're going to go into a whole bunch more next time we meet. At the very top here is a place to select different libraries. Okay. The default is the CAR library, but all those booklets don't exist there. They exist under this library right here, EPUB. EPUB. EPUB stands for e-publications, or electronic publications. So if I click that library, you'll see I have these documents selected. So that's where we get the booklet and then the 2 signature pages, which we'll look at in 1 second. Okay. So I just want to show you how to get to that. I'm not going to go into every booklet page, but I am going to show you number 5. So this is the actual earthquake hazards report. Okay. And this is required for anything built prior to 1960. Okay. And there's a whole bunch of questions here, 1 through 9, that talks about, water heater bracing, home bolted to the foundation. Are there cripple walls under the crawl space? Which, as you start thinking about some of these questions, many of you and many of your clients will have no idea what a lot of this stuff even means or how to check. On the right, it gives you page numbers for where to go figure out, well, what the heck is a cripple wall and how do I figure out if I've got them or not? And if they don't know, there's a box here that says don't know, that they can check. So it's pretty simple on this one to fill out. It's either a yes or no, doesn't apply, i.e. if the home is built on a hillside, not all homes are built on a hillside, or I don't know. And that's it, okay? And they can go look up on the page numbers in the booklet. So that's the earthquake hazards report. And then the next one is the signature page. And this is basically where your clients, buyer and seller, will both sign that they received a copy of the environmental hazards and earthquake safety booklet, which includes lead-based paint, toxic mold, and energy efficiency information. Okay, so this is just a receipt for the electronic publication that you or your TC will email out to your clients. Okay, I see some light at the end of the tunnel here. We're getting close. The next one is the PSD, parking and storage disclosure. Let's take a look at this. This is normally only going to be used when we have a condo, townhome, planned unit area. And it's basically advising the buyer to personally inspect the parking spaces and any storage that is noted to come with the property in a sale. Very important to investigate this, talk with the HOAs, even to look on the preliminary title reports to make sure that your parking spaces are deeded. There are a lot of title companies that stopped insuring parking spaces and storage. So you want to look on the prelim to see if they've removed anything. If it's not on there, then you may need to consider hiring a different title company. Okay, so you want to see if that's on the prelim. And all we're noting here is seller is telling us which parking space they've been using, what storage space they've been using, and then any other disclosures. And then again, it's a recommendation to the buyer to do their own investigation and due diligence. You as agents, by the way, are not required to investigate this information. So you got to be careful. You don't want to say, oh, you get space 12. And then you find out space 12 was traded to your neighbor 10 years ago. And now you're in space 10, which is, a couple, the next floor up or floor down, or it's in the back corner or whatever, right? So, be careful with what you tell people, okay? The seller discloses to the buyer, not us agents. Okay. Next, seller's affidavit. So basically what we've got here is a form called the seller's affidavit of non-foreign status, also known as a FIRPTA. FIRPTA stands for Foreign Investment in Real Property Tax Act. What this has to do with is when we've got foreign individuals or foreign entities, corporations, partnerships, etc., when they sell a property, there's a requirement to withhold a portion of their money and send it straight to the IRS to make sure they don't leave the country without paying any capital gains taxes that they might be due. Okay. And the withholding is somewhere between 10 and 15% of the price of the property. Okay. Escrow will figure out what that number looks like. But here's the thing. It's the buyer's responsibility to obtain this affidavit from the seller to discern whether they need to do the withholding or not. And it's pretty simple, okay? It asks for the seller's information, and then there's two check boxes. One of them says, I am not a non-resident alien, or I am not a foreign corporation. So if they are a legal resident for income tax, right, taxation, they just check whichever box applies to them, individual or corporate, and that's enough to create the affidavit stating that they're not required to withhold. Okay. There is a second part of this called the qualified substitute or direct delivery to buyer. And what this is basically is it's stating that we're going to use a qualified substitute, meaning another person or party or entity to handle the storage of the affidavit, because there may be information on there that the seller does not want to give to the buyer, such as the social security number. This form is worthless without a social security number or a taxpayer ID number. And sometimes the sellers don't want the buyers seeing that information, obviously, right? In which case we have escrow, usually 99% of the time, handle the qualified substitute document for us. And it basically says, escrow is making a declaration that says, I have the affidavit. I have the information needed. Okay. If we're having a qualified substitute, by the way, that's the next form called the qualified substitute. And it's just a simple who's holding the document, who's holding the affidavit. Okay. And that's it. By the way, there is a California withholding requirement. California says that in certain circumstances, the seller is obligated to withhold 3 1/3% of the sales price if they're not exempt from withholding. And the exemptions are pretty simple. If a person is selling their personal residence, they're exempt. If the person is selling and doing a 1031 exchange with investment property, they're exempt. The only time they're usually not exempt is when they're selling a non-personal residence, not their primary residence, and not reinvesting it through a 1031 exchange. So if they're only selling a rental property and just cashing out, then they're going to have to withhold a portion of their proceeds. It's going to go straight to the franchise tax board to pay any taxes they might owe. And if they don't owe any taxes, they'll have a credit towards income tax in the future or a refund. Okay. Escrow declares that they will handle that for the buyers. All right. I think we're at our last one. Let's take a look here. We are. This one we don't make required, but I think it's usually a good idea, especially if there's a discrepancy in data. This is our square footage and lot size disclosure and advisory. This is basically, it's a brand new form, just came out this year in when, like July, I think, something like that. Let's see, where's the date on here? June, okay. So it's stating on here, hey, buyer, if you have a concern or you're buying a property based on the size of the property, either the square footage for living or the lot size, then you should hire somebody to investigate the actual size on your own. And the reason why is because the first paragraph here says there is no one official size source, nor is there a standard method of calculating exterior structural size or interior space. Some of you guys may be shocked to know that, right? There is no correct way to measure the inside of a house, right? Do you include the baseboards or not? Well, what about the closets? They're inside the house, but you can't really live in it. What does that mean, right? So there is no standard. And so you might see discrepancies. In fact, you guys may see discrepancies now in the MLS that's different than the tax records. So the proper way you would use this form is you would go through here and say, first of all, they can just sign it as is. Or if there's a discrepancy, you might put in here and say, you know, the public record showed 1,200 feet, but we just got an appraisal done and it said it's only 1,150. Okay. And then you put in any other additional information. You would include the report, if assuming you've got it, which you probably do. And then you deliver that to your clients. So if there's a discrepancy, that's when you really are going to go through and fill this out. Otherwise, you're just telling the client, hey, if you're buying this because of the size of the property, you should hire the appropriate party and to your own satisfaction. Okay. So that's that. All right, folks, 3:56. Wow. 56 action-packed minutes. I'm all done. Anyone have any questions I can answer for you? I think we're good. As always, I'm getting this recorded. We will get this on our YouTube channels. If you have questions, call, text, email, let me know. I am here for you. Let's do it again soon, 2 weeks from now. I'll see you shortly, all right?
Thanks, Nick.
You got it. Have a wonderful day, everybody.